What if I told you the greatest comeback story in African history didn't happen in modern times? It happened 2,800 years ago, when the Kingdom of Kush rose from the shadows and conquered the very empire that once ruled them. Here's the thing. Africa's history is bigger, richer, and more intertwined than most people ever learned in school. And one of the boldest chapters comes from a place many people don't even put on the historical map, Nubia. Modern-day Sudan, a place where pharaohs were born. A place where pyramids rise from desert sand. A place where an African empire grew so strong that it crossed into Egypt, not as a visitor, not as an ally, but as a ruler's. Today, we're diving into the Kingdom of Kush, the forgotten powerhouse, the empire that ruled Egypt for nearly 100 years. And honestly, the story feels like a movie. Conquest, culture, strategy, legacy, all of it. So sit back, because this one will shift how you see African history forever. Before we dive deep, quick welcome if you're new here. This is History Maker 101, a space where we pull powerful stories from the past and use them to spark something real in the present. Travel, culture, mindset, the lessons people lived through long before us. I'm Michael Dawson, and I try to take history out of the dusty corners and make it feel alive again. Because the truth is, stories like this aren't just about what happened. They're mirrors. They show us what's possible. So if you're someone who loves learning, thinking differently, or just seeing the world with new eyes, you're in the right place. All right, let's get into it. Where the story begins, the rise of Nubia ***. Picture the Nile wide, glittering, ancient. Now move your imagination south, past the pyramids everyone knows, past the tourist postcards, into a stretch of river framed by granite cliffs, desert plains, and valleys filled with gold-rich soil. This is Nubia, the homeland of the Kingdom of Kush, a civilization that grew beside Egypt, learned from Egypt, traded with Egypt, but never bowed to Egypt. For thousands of years, Nubia was the gatekeeper of the Nile's southern frontier. Caravans carrying incense, ivory, exotic animals, and gold had to pass through Nubian lands. Egyptian pharaohs envied them so much they built forts just to control Nubian wealth. And here's the part history books gloss over. Even during Egypt's strongest dynasties, Kush built its own cities, its own gods, its own warrior culture. It wasn't a shadow. It was a neighbor watching, waiting, learning. Then came the collapse of Egypt's new kingdom. Civil wars, weak pharaohs, foreign invasions, economic decline. Egypt's crown, once feared across continents, was suddenly shaky, and Kush looked north and realized something bold, powerful, and undeniable. The greatest empire in Africa was vulnerable, and history rewards those who act. Napata, the birthplace of African pharaohs. When the spotlight finally shifts to Kush, we arrive in Napata, the capital at the foot of the sacred Jebel, Barkal Mountain. To the Nubians, this mountain wasn't just a rock formation. It was the earthly home of Amun, the same god worshipped in Egypt's Thebes. That connection mattered. Napata became a spiritual engine, a political chessboard, and a cultural forge all at once. Hey, kings didn't just command armies. They were trained in rituals, astronomy, diplomacy, and the sacred art of kingship. Many had spent time in Egypt, studying their traditions, absorbing their politics, and observing their weaknesses firsthand. Meanwhile, Egypt was splintering into small rival states. Local rulers fought for scraps of legitimacy. Priests battled generals. Ordinary people suffered under instability. To Kush, this wasn't chaos. This was an invitation. And from Napata came a new kind of leader, one who believed the Nile Valley didn't need two competing civilizations. It needed unity. The pharaoh who started it all, Kashta. Enter Kashta, a king whose power didn't come from fear but from understanding how Egypt worked at its core. He didn't march into Egypt with armies burning everything in sight. He walked in like someone who already belonged there. Kashta installed his daughter, Amenerdes, as the god's wife of Amun in Thebes, one of the highest religious positions in the country. This wasn't just a title. It was a link to Egypt's spiritual heartbeat. By placing his daughter there, Kashta tied Kush to Egypt's religious authority. Priests and nobles suddenly had to acknowledge Kushite influence. And ordinary Egyptians saw a southern king who respected their traditions more than their own divided rulers did. Kashta didn't take Egypt by force. He took it by legitimacy. He set the stage. But the man who would step onto that stage and finish the transformation was someone unforgettable. Piye, the king who took Egypt without apology. Piye Kashta's son wasn't just a conqueror. He was a thinker, a reformer, and a man who believed that civilization should be restored, not exploited. When he saw Egypt tearing itself apart, he didn't hesitate. He launched a campaign that was methodical, patient, and unstoppable. City by city, he advanced, sometimes welcome as a savior, sometimes resisted as an outsider. He accepted both reactions with the confidence of a king who already knew how this story ended. One by one, Egyptian rulers bent the knee, not only because Piye was militarily superior, but because he carried himself like the kind of leader Egypt had been missing for generations. When the campaign ended, Piye recorded his victory in a masterpiece known as a Victory Stella, describing battles, strategies, and even his disappointment at the decadence of Egyptian nobles. He crowned himself pharaoh, not a foreign king occupying the throne, but the rightful ruler of a united Nile Valley. With Piye, the 25th dynasty began. For the first time in recorded history, African leadership, African identity, and African power ruled from the Mediterranean Sea to the heart of Sudan. A dynasty of power, the Kushite pharaohs. After Piye, a line of remarkable Kushite kings continued building a dynasty that revitalized Egypt. Shabaka, known for his intelligence, ordered scribes to preserve ancient Egyptian texts that were crumbling, some of which only survive today because of him. Shabitku, a warrior king, strengthened Egypt's defenses and maintained unity during restless times. Taharqa, the dynasty's most famous ruler, oversaw a golden age of temple construction, economic revival, and military achievement. Under his reign, Egypt and Kush looked stronger than they had in centuries. But Taharqa faced a new superpower rising in the north, the Assyrian Empire. Their armies were ruthless, disciplined, and expansion-hungry. They invaded repeatedly, burning cities, toppling alliances. Taharqa fought them fiercely, becoming a symbol of African resistance. Even when the Assyrians finally pushed the Kushites out of Egypt, they never broke Kushite identity or erased what the 25th dynasty achieved. For nearly 100 years, Kushite pharaohs healed Egypt's wounds, revived traditions, and left a cultural imprint that still lives in temples and records today. They weren't Egypt's imitators. They were Egypt's restorers. The move to Meroë, reinvention, not collapse. Losing Egypt wasn't the end of Kush, it was the beginning of its next transformation. The kingdom moved its capital south to Meroë, a region filled with iron ore, forests for fuel, and trade routes linking Africa's interior to the Red Sea. Meroë didn't copy Napata. It reinvented Kushite civilization entirely. They became master iron smelters so prolific that ancient writers described Meroë as a city that smoked like a furnace. They developed international trade networks connecting Central Africa, Arabia, and the Mediterranean. Their queens, known as Candaces, wielded real political and military power, leading armies and negotiating treaties. And their culture evolved too. They created the Meroitic script, one of the oldest writing systems in sub-Saharan Africa, still only partly deciphered. And those pyramids, they built hundreds, more than double the number in all of Egypt. Kush didn't fade. It innovated. Legacy, what the Kingdom of Kush means today. The story of Kush isn't just ancient history. It's a reminder of Africa's role as a creator, not a passenger of civilization. Kush challenged empires. Kush ruled Egypt. Kush preserved knowledge. Kush built monuments that still rise above Sudan's sands today. And perhaps the most powerful symbol is this. If you count all the pyramids across Africa, most of them aren't in Egypt, they're in Sudan. Proof that Africa's greatest stories aren't always the ones the world chooses to highlight. They are the ones we choose to seek. If this chapter of African history opened your eyes, remember, there are countless more stories buried under dunes, carved in stone, or whispered through oral traditions. Stories of innovation. Stories of courage. Stories of nations that shaped the world long before the world learned to write about them. The Kingdom of Kush wasn't a chapter placed in the margins. It was a headline waiting to be read. And the more we tell these stories, the more we transform the way the world sees Africa and the way Africa sees itself. If you want more deep history, culture, and mindset stories, hit subscribe, drop a comment, and share this with someone who needs to see Africa beyond the stereotypes. More stories on the way. This is History Maker 101, and this journey is just beginning.